The thing that will change everything. Sometimes I look back and all the significant events of my life appear to me as rooms in a long gray corridor. Some rooms are bright, radiating joy. Others are dark and grim, places you don't want to enter. But memory pushes you into the darkness anyway, whether you want it or not. And then there are the special rooms, so particular that sometimes it's hard to believe they exist at all. One of those rooms is far down the corridor. The number on its door is 1985. Lately, I find myself going back to it more and more. I step inside and I see the ghosts, Anfisa and Vasily Lunev, their boy, Lyosha. But the main character of that story is a transistor radio, an Alpinist 321. A radio that proved to me there are things that contradict every rule of this world, but are perfectly natural in another. Spring of 1985. I was an engineer at an electromechanical plant, 2 years married. Everything in order if you didn't count the small troubles that come with ordinary life. My neighbors on the same floor, Vasily, Anfisa, and their son Lyosha, seemed the same way. Whenever I met them in the stairwell or out on the street, they were always smiling warmly. It was only later that I learned the doctors had diagnosed Lyosha with some rare illness, and that he didn't have long. I can't imagine what those smiles cost them. Lyosha didn't look sick, normal kid, freckled, a little chubby like his mother. I remember he loved riding his bicycle. His father once put a noisemaker on the spokes, and Lyosha rode around the courtyard clicking and rattling and completely unaware that a fatal disease had already taken root in his body. But it wasn't the disease that took him. Lyosha disappeared without a trace during the first spring thunderstorm. He vanished along with the bicycle. The other boys said he'd been acting strange that day, constantly stopping to listen to something, staring at the ground in front of him, not responding when anyone called. When the sky went dark with clouds, he got on his bike and rode in the direction of the old garages, riding hard, as if afraid to miss something. Then the thunder came. The rain started. The boy who saw him last said Lyosha disappeared into the rain. Disappeared into the rain. That clumsy, childlike phrase stayed in my head for a long time. There was something in it that felt final and irreversible. They searched for him everywhere. The surrounding forests were combed. Divers went into the pond behind the garages. Nothing. The boy had vanished along with his bicycle, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Rumors about a child-abducting maniac spread through the neighborhood and then faded. Anfisa, a short, sturdy woman with dimples in her cheeks and eyes perpetually hidden behind a red fringe, was beside herself. Every time I saw her, she was rushing somewhere, to the police, to the garages. She gave the impression of a coiled spring wound to its limit, ready to snap at any moment. Vasily was different. Within days of Lyosha's disappearance, he seemed to have already accepted that they wouldn't find his son. He began grieving in advance, as if trying to get a head start on the road that healing required. Maybe it was a strategy he'd already developed when they learned about Lyosha's illness. Anfisa was full of nervous, almost frantic hope. Vasily was drifting down a quiet river of grief. That difference became the source of their conflict. May was ending. Vasily told Anfisa one evening that perhaps this was even for the best, that it would have been far worse to watch the illness take him day by day. Then he added, "Life goes on. We need to learn to live without him." My wife Tamara and I were visiting them when he said it. Only with us did they talk freely. We were the only guests they still invited. Vasily had broken an unspoken rule by saying what he said, and the silence that followed was physical. I could feel the tension swelling in the air. Anfisa trembled. Her eyes went wide, her fists clenched. She shouted, "Live without him? What are you saying?" She overturned her chair, getting up. She looked at her husband as if she could destroy him with her gaze. "If you ever say anything like that to me again, I will hate you." She left the room. Vasily sat with his head sunk between his shoulders. He didn't try to respond. He looked like the most miserable man in the world. A man who knew he'd lost not only his son, but his wife. "I'm sorry," he said after a long pause. "I didn't expect her to react like that. But I had to say it. I had to. She's going mad. She talks to his things, and I think it's only going to get worse." He repeated the last sentence without the "I think," and he was right. Anfisa began carrying Lyosha's belongings with her everywhere in a large bag, unable to be separated from them for even a moment. His sneakers, a stamp album, a Rubik's Cube, a set of colored pencils. She seemed to believe these things had some magnetic force, something that could draw him back the way a magnet finds a needle lost in hay. So it was a terrible blow when Vasily threw the things away while she slept. He meant well, no doubt. He thought that cutting that thread might not cure her, but at least push her toward healing. He saw no other way. It was a radical, even cruel measure, but sometimes a wound has to be cauterized to save a life. It didn't work. When Anfisa discovered what he'd done, she ran to the trash bins. The garbage had already been collected. Without pausing, she went to the city landfill and spent an entire day searching. She didn't find Lyosha's things, but she came back from the landfill not empty-handed. She brought home a chair leg. With that chair leg, she beat her husband, cursing him in language no one could have imagined coming from this quiet, educated woman. The door to their apartment was wide open. All the neighbors ran in, including me. We pulled Anfisa away from him, but she kept screaming. And Vasily sat in the corner weeping with his arms over his head. Not from the beating. That same evening, he packed and left for relatives in another city. Some neighbors thought he'd run away from his troubles, abandoned his wife in her worst state. I didn't judge him. He had reached the end of what he could endure. He had given everything, and he had nothing left. Anfisa didn't accept the loss of Lyosha's things. She made a daily routine of going to the dumpsters in our courtyard. Whatever it was she was looking for, I think she didn't know herself. She began bringing home broken objects she called good little things. A dead iron, a clock with a cracked face, a worn-out electric razor, a porcelain ballerina with her head broken off, a tennis racket without strings. I often saw her in her red beret and gloves, digging through the bin, pulling something out, examining it carefully, murmuring to herself. She looked genuinely absorbed. Sometimes, when she found a new, good little thing, she actually looked happy. One day she stopped me in the stairwell and asked why Tamara and I had stopped coming for tea. She said she was always glad to see us. Tamara and I hadn't been sure that was true anymore. We'd begun to wonder if she was glad to see anyone. I didn't make excuses. I promised we'd come that evening. We brought half an apple pie, a jar of jam, and a box of tea. Anfisa received us warmly. For a while, over tea in the kitchen, talking about small things, she seemed almost like her old self. But then, she invited us into the living room and began showing us her finds, and I understood that she was not her old self and perhaps never would be again. Every shelf, every cabinet was filled with good little things. She looked at them with the reverence of someone standing before priceless artifacts in the world's finest museum. "I found this 2 weeks ago," she said breathlessly, pointing to a flashlight with a cracked casing. "A wonderful thing. That morning I woke up knowing I'd find something good. I searched for 2 hours, and I did." She moved to a shelf that had once held books. "And this I found in early August. A wall clock, or what remained of one. The rain was coming down in buckets that day, but I went out anyway. I was completely soaked, even caught a little cold, but it was worth it. Just look at this thing. It's a miracle." There was such genuine wonder in her eyes that I found myself asking whether she really did see something beautiful in all of this. Maybe her imagination overlaid these broken things with a radiance only she could perceive. "And this one is special," she said, opening a cabinet and presenting a plain steel ball bearing on a square of blue velvet. "Isn't it lovely? I can't stop looking at it. It's as if angels made it." Honest to God, in that moment, the ball bearing seemed beautiful to me too. She had transmitted her feeling of wonder directly. "As if angels made it," she repeated dreamily. "But the most important thing, I haven't found it yet. The thing that will change everything." I looked at her. "What do you mean, change everything?" She shrugged. "I don't know exactly, but when I find it, something important will happen. Something very, very important." And I wanted her to find it. I wished her luck with complete sincerity. We visited her occasionally after that, out of pity, if I'm honest. And she always showed us her latest finds. She needed someone to show them to. One evening I came home from work and found Anfisa on the landing. She was agitated. When she spoke, her voice trembled. "I think it happened. I found it!" She opened her large bag. "Look, Mitya!" Inside lay a radio the size of a brick. I felt a flicker of disappointment. I'd expected something more significant. "This is the thing that will change everything. I'm certain." Her eyes were feverishly bright. "Come on, we have to turn it on, right now." "All right," I said, just to make her happy. I had serious doubts the radio would even work. People don't throw out things that still function. We went into her apartment and into the living room. Anfisa removed her find from the bag with ceremony and set it on the table. It was an Alpinist 321. Scratched light brown casing, cracked glass over the frequency dial. I was now certain this thing would never make a sound. But Anfisa pressed the power button with an eagerness that didn't diminish even when nothing happened. "Batteries!" She slapped her forehead. "Of course, there must be no batteries." She flipped it over and opened the battery compartment. Empty. She looked at me with hope, and I, anticipating the question, said, "I have batteries. I'll get them now." "Hurry, Mitya!" she almost begged. As I went to my own apartment, I thought that I wasn't just playing along with her madness. I had become part of it. And the strange thing was, I didn't feel foolish. I genuinely wanted that old Alpinist 321 to show signs of life. My wife met me in the hallway and said I looked strange. She was right. She could see the anxiety and excitement on my face that had transferred from Anfisa. I told her about the radio and went to find batteries. Outside the windows, the sky had darkened and rain had begun, though 5 minutes earlier the evening had been perfectly clear. "The rain is good," Anfisa said when I returned, inserting the batteries with shaking hands. "Rain is very, very good." There, she pressed the button without ceremony. Static came from the speaker. The Alpinist 321 worked. It made me happy, but I suddenly realized I'd been expecting something more. What exactly, I couldn't have said. I felt like a child who finds the Christmas present under the tree, and it's not quite the right thing. "Everything is fine," Anfisa smiled, and she turned the tuning dial confidently, as though she knew exactly what would happen next. And then something impossible happened. The radio began to emit a green glow. Strange shadows moved across the walls and ceiling. The static in the speaker became rhythmic, like the sound of breathing. A thought took shape in my mind. This can't be happening. It cannot be happening. But it was. The green light grew brighter, pulsing, as if in time with a heartbeat inside the Alpinist 321. I know how absurd that sounds. I knew it then, too. Anfisa spread her arms wide and took a deep breath, as if trying to draw the light into herself. "Mama, Mama, it's me, Lyosha," came a clear voice from the speaker. "I know you can hear me." I felt the floor shift under my feet. Anfisa threw herself at the radio and grabbed it. Yes, son, I hear you. She began to weep. "Where are you?" "I'm in a good place, Mama. It's beautiful here, and I'm not sick anymore. No one here is ever sick. I missed you." Anfisa was crying, pressing the radio to her chest. I had a knot in my throat. I was witnessing a miracle, and the miracle was somehow clean. I can't find a better word for it. That cleanliness made it impossible to doubt what was real. What does a person feel when they encounter something supernatural? Fear? Confusion? Yes, probably. But what I felt was something closer to offense, as if I had been lied to my whole life, kept from a universal secret, as if I had been living in a false world up until that moment. "I want to come to you," Anfisa managed through her tears. "Soon, Mama," Lyosha answered. "But now There was a rush of static. That's all. I have to go. But I'll reach you again. I promise." The green light faded. The speaker went silent. "How can this be?" Anfisa whimpered. "How can this be, son?" She looked at me, needing support. I took hold of myself and said in a hoarse voice, "He'll reach you again." "You heard him. He promised." Anfisa smiled and wiped her eyes with her palm. "Yes, he promised." We stood facing each other for a long time. Two people for whom the world had just permanently changed. Outside the windows, the rain kept falling, and in that sound, I thought I could hear Lyosha's voice. "I'll reach you again. Reach you again." I didn't tell Tamara what had happened. Something inside me was saying, "Don't tell anyone, or the magic will be gone." That night, I lay awake for a long time thinking about the place Lyosha had described, where it's beautiful and no one is ever sick. Where could it be? A parallel world? Another planet? My imagination conjured visions too large and strange to hold. The next day was a Sunday. Tamara had gone to visit her mother. I went to Anfisa in the afternoon. "Lyosha spoke to me again," she said, her face radiant. "Just half an hour ago, he gave me instructions. He explained what needs to be done to reach him." "Instructions?" I said. "Yes, nothing difficult, but..." She caught herself. "Forgive me, Mitya. I can't tell you everything. Lyosha said it's only for me. It's personal." Personal, of course. I burned with curiosity, but held myself back from pressing her. I even felt a flicker of something like anger. Excluded from the secret, as if I weren't trusted. Anfisa seemed to sense it. "Don't be offended," she said gently. "Your time simply hasn't come yet. But it will. Believe me." That felt like a promise made to quiet a child. I went home in a dim mood. That evening, the rain started again, heavy and sudden, and with it came a strong feeling that something was about to happen. I went out onto the landing. Anfisa's door was ajar, and through the gap, a greenish light was leaking out. I didn't hesitate. I entered quietly, afraid to disturb whatever was happening. In the light coming from the radio, I saw Anfisa. She was standing by the open balcony door. The wind moved her hair. The curtains and shears billowed like sails. Raindrops caught the light and glittered like emeralds. "Take the radio, Mitya," she said without turning. "It belongs to you now." She stepped onto the balcony and disappeared into the rain. She was there, and then she was not, as if she had dissolved into the air. The green glow drew itself back inside the radio. The living room settled into a restless dark. I thought, she's there now, in the place where no one is ever sick. She's with her son. I felt a sadness I hadn't expected. I wanted the radio to start working again. I wanted to receive the instructions and step through into the unknown. I wanted to see that world with my own eyes. But my time hadn't come yet. I picked up the Alpinist 321 and went home. I stood at the window for a long time, looking into the rain-blurred courtyard. At some point, I thought I saw two figures standing near the swings, a large one and a small one. It was probably just my imagination. No one searched very hard for Anfisa. She went somewhere and vanished, was the version that satisfied everyone, especially given that all the neighbors had long since decided she was not well. Our neighbor from the first floor said one day, "Anfisa's suffering is over. She's in a better world now." I nodded. "Yes," I said, "she's in a better world." 47 years have passed since then. I'm an old man now. My heart gives me trouble. I can't get through the day without medication. My wife passed away last month, and there is nothing left in this world holding me here. It's time to open another door in the corridor. I think my time has finally come. It's autumn. Rain is falling. The Alpinist 321 is in front of me. I've just put in fresh batteries. All that's left is to turn it on, find the right frequency, and disappear into the rain.
Butcher. When they broke in, she was still alive. She couldn't scream, for reasons I won't detail here, but faint sounds still came from her, and the exposed vessels in her skin were pulsing rapidly. I stood over her with my instrument, my sculptor's tool, thinking about the final touch that would complete my new work. These worthless newspaper hacks who called me the Butcher, what do they understand? Cattle, dull non-entities, the concentrated essence of the mob. I am not some common sexual deviant. I am an artist. My material is simply not cold marble, but living flesh. I take the most degraded object imaginable and transform it into something of beauty. A civilization of the mob cannot appreciate such work. They will simply incinerate it or bury it to rot, and nothing will remain except police photographs. But does a true artist care about recognition from the mob? I had already identified the point where my tool should make its final mark, and at that precise moment, they broke down the door. No announcement, just a sudden impact, and they were inside. I turned toward them, in my apron, with the instrument in my right hand, and in the same instant, two heavy blows struck my chest and threw me back onto the table where my creation lay. I heard the shots after the impacts, which is strange given the short distance, but that is what happened. There was no pain. I was surprised by its absence, and surprised that they were shooting at all. They could have taken me alive. They chose not to. I understood. They hated me for what I did. Not for the women. What are they to anyone? But for daring to place myself above the crowd. They knew the death penalty had been abolished and decided to claim I had resisted arrest. Pathetic hypocrites. While these thoughts moved through me, my vision darkened and a thin ringing began in my ears, then cut off abruptly. And then, through a red darkness, the outlines of the room began to reappear, the way a photograph develops in a tray. I felt no pain. I realized I could no longer feel my body at all. I couldn't even determine whether my eyes were open. The room appeared from an unusual angle, and I understood that I was looking down from somewhere near the ceiling. Below me was my own body, half collapsed across my last work, our blood mingling.
It could have made an interesting composition, actually, though the position was wrong. I wanted to correct it, but couldn't. Something was pulling me upward gently, and I expected to hit the ceiling, but passed through it as if it were nothing at all. I anticipated a roof, an attic. Instead, I was in a gray circular tunnel stretching toward a foggy distance where light burned. I flew toward it at increasing speed, feeling no resistance, and the flight lasted long enough that I began to fear it would never end. Then, the circle of light rushed toward me, and I was expelled from the tunnel like a shell from a barrel. I emerged in the air at enormous height, perhaps 2 kilometers. Below me, flooded with brilliant sunlight, stretched a city unlike any I had ever seen, and I was falling toward it. The city was immense, extending in every direction as far as perception could reach. In this world, the horizon was much farther away than on Earth. In fact, it dissolved into haze rather than ending cleanly. The city seemed to contain all the cities of Earth at once: glass and concrete towers, classical colonnaded mansions, steep medieval rooftops, eastern domed palaces. Canals glittered in the sun. Cars moved along multi-lane highways while horse-drawn carriages rolled quietly over cobblestones. If this is the heavenly Jerusalem, paradise is considerably more technological than the priests imagined, I thought. They would turn green knowing that someone like me ended up here. As if in response to this thought, I noticed that my direction of flight had changed. I was still descending, but was being carried increasingly sideways. The vast rooftops, gardens, and parks of the city slid past beneath me, and I might have reassured myself that I was simply being delivered to a particular district. But the houses thinned, vacant lots appeared, and I was being carried further and further out. Eventually, the outskirts gave way to hills and small copses. I was no longer falling, but gliding slowly lower, like an aircraft in a long approach. Below me came farmhouses surrounded by yellowing fields and isolated manor houses in old styles. As I flew, the light gradually dimmed. The great city, still just visible in the distance, was bathed in bright midday, but over the landscape I moved through, day was declining toward evening. The vegetation grew sparser. Trees disappeared. Grass broke into scattered patches. Ugly branches of thornbush rose from clay and stone. Dusk deepened. The light ahead was darker still. Behind me, toward the city, light remained. My speed dropped. The rocky ground rose to meet me. I hit it with both feet, fell, rolled, and felt that I had a body again. I got to my feet, confirmed I had my usual clothes and shoes, and looked around. A nearly lifeless desert, gray in the post-sunset twilight. A steady, remarkably even wind pushed at my back, forward, into the dark. I had no intention of obeying this unspoken directive. I turned and walked toward the invisible distant city. But with each step, the pressure increased. Not wind, exactly. It didn't steal my breath or cut my face with grit, more like a force that grew as I walked toward the city. I leaned forward into it, teeth clenched, and eventually could not make any progress at all. I tried dropping to all fours and crawling. Nothing worked. Something was blocking my path to the city. I gave up and walked into the desert. I walked for hours. On Earth, I would have been suffering from thirst and fatigue by now. Here, I felt neither. Only a dull misery from the landscape and the absence of any idea what lay ahead. The light remained constant, confirming it was tied to distance from the city rather than to any time of day. And in this faint, constant twilight, I suddenly saw a person. He was sitting motionless some distance off my path, and at first I mistook him for a large stone. But there were no large stones in this part of the desert. I called out and waved, and when he didn't respond, I jogged toward him. What I found was entirely biblical in appearance. An emaciated old man sat on a rock, barefoot and in rags, his dirty gray hair and beard so long and tangled they nearly hid his face. "Can I help you?" I asked reflexively. "No," he said. "There is no help here." "Where is here exactly?" "Have you lost your sight or your mind?" "In hell." The city didn't seem especially infernal. "The city is there, and you are here," he said. "Why don't you simply go back?" "There seems to be a problem with that," I admitted. "Of course there is," he answered with clear satisfaction. "It's harder than cutting women." I started to object, then stopped. How did he know? And in the same moment, I simply knew his story. He had been a wealthy man, the head of a financial empire. Money and success were his only values. He had ruined competitors, displaced thousands of workers, stolen from partners through fraud, bought courts and press, a textbook ruthless, insatiable operator. "How long have you been here?" I asked. "There is no time here, only eternity." "And space? How far does this desert go? Is there anything else?" "Go and find out," he said, with another unpleasant smile. I walked away without looking back. His laughter followed me into the dark. About an hour later, the pressure that had been pushing me forward disappeared entirely. I seemed to have arrived wherever I was supposed to be. I looked around and saw a castle. It was an imposing Gothic structure, the kind you find illustrated in books about vampires. High and narrow, it raised battlemented towers to the twilight sky. No moat, no outer wall. The lancet windows were dark. The heavy gates stood open. I shrugged and walked in. My suspicion that the castle had been arranged specifically for me was quickly confirmed. Several of its rooms reproduced the interiors of apartments I had lived in. Others were furnished according to my taste. Bookshelves, a television, and a telephone. I turned on the television. Only one channel, showing a film I had already seen. I picked up the telephone receiver and thought about who to call. I had no friends, living or dead. I eventually dialed the police. Long rings, no answer. Continuing my exploration, I found excellent dungeons that suited the building's style far better than its modern conveniences. A fine setting for my work, but no material. If all the women who die on Earth end up here eventually, material would be available in abundance. But something told me the rules here were different. The castle was too grim for ordinary tastes, but not for mine. If this was where I was to spend my time, it was not the worst arrangement imaginable. Several days passed. I made unpleasant discoveries. The television showed only the one film, Forever. The books on the shelves were all books I had already read, and the passages I only half remembered had their pages torn, stained, or garbled. The best books I remembered being better than they now seemed. A slow, pervasive boredom began to set in. And with the boredom, a growing fear that this was how it would always be. Then one day, a car horn sounded from outside the gates. A magnificent black automobile from the 1940s, the kind German generals drive in war films. I ran downstairs. The man who stepped out wore an expensive three-piece suit of the mid-century cut. A heavy build, a slightly puffy face, dark hair combed back with threads of gray. "Walter Osterman," he said. "You're a Nazi war criminal," I said. It wasn't a question. "And you're the Ripper," he replied with equal calm. "Perhaps we might go inside." We sat by the fire. Osterman explained the mechanics of this world with the precision of someone who had spent decades studying it. The city, those called good people by themselves and others, generated its own light by concentrated proximity. Those with individual philosophies or particular ideologies, neither beloved nor hated by the crowd, lived in the suburbs and smaller towns. Those who provoked widespread revulsion, like the two of us, were pushed to the outskirts, into the twilight zone. The very worst, the great tyrants, the architects of mass atrocity, were expelled further still into complete darkness and total solitude. Not as a judgment handed down by any external authority, but as a natural consequence of how this world's physics worked. Antipathy repelled, empathy attracted. It was as simple as gravity. And what of all this? I gestured at the castle, the books, the television. Memory, he said. Everything you see here is your own memory of things you experienced in life. To encounter anything new, you need to meet others who remember different things, or create them yourself. It's quite possible to live tolerably well here. I've managed it for decades. He paused, then smiled in a conspiratorial way that made me pay closer attention. But there is something else I wanted to discuss with you. Something rather more practical. Return. Return to the living world? You were taught that this was impossible, and yet you were also taught that it was accomplished by at least one man named Jesus, and a few others with his assistance. I find no evidence that story is true in any literal sense, but the underlying idea is physically sound. Death is a transition to a lower energy state. The process runs naturally in one direction only, but with sufficient additional energy applied, the reverse transition is possible. And after many years of work, I have assembled a device that can accomplish this practically. And you want me to be your test subject. You're perceptive. And I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. Here one cannot hide intentions, even if one tries. Yes, there is a risk. The energy my device can generate is limited, possibly by a fundamental constraint of this world. It may be just enough to push you across the threshold, or it may fall short, in which case nothing terrible happens. You simply remain here. But if you do cross, you cannot return to your own body. The body is gone, or inaccessible. You would need a living receptacle, a living brain, occupied by its own personality, which must be displaced. The energy required is enormous unless the resident personality is already weakened, unless the person's life force is at a very low ebb. You need someone nearly dead, or recovering, someone whose energy is returning. If the worst happens and you die in the new body before it stabilizes, you return here in a significantly weakened state, and a subsequent attempt would be genuinely dangerous. So for the first few years, you would need to be careful. And in exchange, a message from your first victim in the new life, sent here to confirm the transit was successful. Choose carefully. The messenger needs to end up here, in the twilight, not in the city. Someone sufficiently compromised. Make a bargain with her. A quick end in exchange for delivering my confirmation. I was quiet for a moment. When I die in the new body eventually, assuming I survive long enough, I return here safely? After a few years, yes. Your energy will have stabilized. Show me the device. His villa was neat, German, surrounded by an orderly garden. Behind it, a windowless outbuilding housed the laboratory. The machine inside looked like something from a Frankenstein film. Coiled pipes, polished metal spheres trailing wires, enormous solenoid coils, impressive-looking switches, round gauges like pressure meters. I understood this aesthetic was simply Osterman's own. If he had died in my era, I would have seen a computer terminal and blinking lights instead. I lay down on the narrow table at the machine's center. He fastened the cuffs to my wrists and ankles and placed a wire-covered crown on my head.
"Safe travels," said Osterman, taking hold of the switch. "Remember our arrangement."
A last thought. I could stop this. The new body would come with an entire life I knew nothing about. Relatives, friends, a language I might not speak. Perhaps a police record. But this posthumous existence had grown suffocating in just a few weeks. On Earth, I had always taken risks, and greater ones than this. And to be the first to return from the dead, that was something. He threw the switch. The machine hummed and crackled. Small lightning arcs leapt between the spheres. A bright radiance filled the air. A tickling warmth spread through my body. The hum reached its peak, and for a moment I felt myself flying apart into 1,000 fragments. Then it stopped. I opened my eyes. A perfectly white ceiling above me. Somewhere to my right, the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment. I turned my head and saw an IV drip. A hospital, as expected. I tried to move, testing the new body. Arms, legs, both present, both responding. But there was a sensation of tight wrapping. I carefully moved my left hand toward my right under the blanket. I felt bandaging. Above the elbow and below. I raised my hand to my face, also bandaged. A significant accident then. Good. Head trauma would explain the amnesia. Are the teeth intact? I tried to check with my tongue. I couldn't. My heart began to pound. I put my hand to my mouth. No front teeth. No tongue. I raised my hand to my eyes. 2.5 fingers. I knew, even as the understanding arrived, exactly what I would find. With whatever strength this ruined body possessed, I tore at the bandages, feeling the deep, familiar wounds underneath, recognizing the precise signature of my own work. And then I screamed and grew more horrified with every second by the sound of my own voice. My new voice was a woman's.